Alicia. Today I'm going to be discussing Chapter 5 of the textbook Governing Texas. Chapter 5 is all about campaigns and elections in Texas. Governors and senators often have important national standing and sometimes move on to national offices. The governor has the power to set the state political agenda, promoting or vetoing statewide legislation, and influencing public policy in the state by other means. Elections to the city council, school boards, state legislature, governorship, and the U.S. Senate all make a huge difference in our lives. Education funding, healthcare policy, taxes, and environmental policy are all influenced by them. Texans select candidates for national, state, and local offices and vote in special elections. There are many types of elections, including primary elections, general elections, city elections, school board elections, special elections, elections for community college boards and the governing boards for many special districts, and bond elections for city, county, and state governments. Many Texans use party affiliation to determine their vote, but local elections are often nonpartisan, so voters may consider race, gender, ethnicity, age, or other characteristics when choosing a candidate. It's difficult for voters to process all the information and make choices. Voters often rely on mental shortcuts called cues to make voting decisions. These cues include partisanship, race, gender, ethnicity, and other demographic characteristics. In theory, these elections are meant to empower the people to exercise some direct control over each branch. However, in practice, one-party dominance and low levels of voter participation have often told a different story, leaving the government to special interests and big money. Primary elections are the first of the elections in the electoral cycle. In Texas, primary elections are usually held on the second Tuesday in March of even-numbered years. At this time, there's a ballot vote in which the citizens select a party nominee for the general election. These elections are funded by the parties in the state, but run by the parties and conducted in all 254 Texas counties. Within each county, voters cast ballots in precincts. The number of precincts depends on the county's population. Those seeking party nomination file papers and pay a filing fee to their party. Winning the primary election requires an absolute majority vote, where the winner has more votes than all the other opponents combined. If no candidate receives an absolute majority, then a runoff primary is held between the two candidates receiving the most votes. Voters who participate in the Republican Party primary cannot vote in a Democratic runoff and vice versa. But those who didn't vote in either primary can vote in either the Republican or the Democratic runoff primary. An open primary allows any registered voter to cast a ballot in either primary, but not both primaries. The Texas Constitution and election laws called the Texas system a closed primary because one must declare their party affiliation before voting, but in reality it's more of an open primary because voters are not required to declare their affiliation until arriving at the polls. Before receiving a primary ballot, the voter signs a roll sheet indicating eligibility to vote and pledging to support the party's candidate. By signing the roll sheet, the voter makes a declaration of party affiliation, but because the affiliation is declared only a few moments prior to voting, the primary is closed but barely. The declaration in no way legally binds a voter to support the party's candidate in future elections. General elections are elections in which voters cast ballots to select public officials. They're held on the first Tuesday following the first Monday in November of even-numbered years. In Texas, major state officials are elected in non-presidential years called midterm elections, seeking to prevent presidential candidates from influencing the outcomes of Texas races. Members of city councils, school boards, and other local government entities are also selected by general elections. However, these usually take place at a different time of year than the national and state elections. In many cases, this timing translates into very low voter turnout, and like I've said before, these elections are nonpartisan, meaning that the political parties of the candidates are not listed on the ballot. A special election is an election that is not held on a regularly scheduled basis. In Texas, a special election is called to fill a vacancy in office, to give approval for the state government to borrow money, or to ratify or reject amendments to the Texas Constitution. For example, if a school district wanted to borrow money to build a new school or an amendment to the Constitution is proposed, a special election would need to be held. Running as an independent in Texas is very uncommon. Each state decides its own requirements for getting on the ballot, and the Texas process is complicated with substantial requirements. It requires the candidate to obtain signatures on a petition from registered voters. The signatures must equal 1% of the total votes in the last governor's race and be from registered voters who did not vote in the primary elections. Signature collection cannot begin until the day after the last primary election, and voters may sign only one candidate's petition. We've all heard the phrase, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend." Well, the two major parties take this to heart when it comes to independents working together to keep competitors out of the statewide competitions. Elections may be open in Texas, but they work through the dominant political parties, helping to solidify their control over the political process and the major political offices in the state. On top of all of these requirements, they lack the political support of a party organization and a party label on the ballot, so it's very difficult for a third party to make any headway in Texas. Voting is the most common and basic form of political participation. Other forms of political participation include signing petitions, protesting and writing letters to newspapers and elected officials. Issues include who can vote, how easy it is to register to vote, and why so few Texans vote. The franchise refers to the act of voting or the right to vote. Throughout the Democratic 19th and 20th century, there were many restrictions on the franchise. Enacted in 1902, the poll tax was a state-imposed tax on voters as a prerequisite for voting to supposedly cover the cost of elections. The poll taxes could range from $1.50 to $1.75, which at that time could be several days' wages for some people. Poll tax funds were used to help party supporters that couldn't afford to vote. Women were allowed to vote in primaries and party conventions in Texas in 1918. Then the 19th Amendment, ratified in 1919, guaranteed women the right to vote in all elections. Texas was the first southern state to ratify the amendment, being the 9th state overall due to the support of Governor William P. Hobby, who called a special session of the legislature for its consideration. Joseph Weldon Bailey, among others, was passionately against women's suffrage, arguing that women could not vote because they could not perform the three basic duties of citizenship: jury service, citizens who are deputized to deal with an emergency, and military service. He believed that women's morals dictated their beliefs and that women would force their beliefs on men, which would lead to the prohibition of alcohol. And God forbid someone were to prohibit alcohol. The white primary, in which only white voters were eligible to participate, was the most oppressive restriction on the franchise, specifically against African Americans. In 1923, the Texas legislature flatly prohibited African Americans from voting in the Democratic primary. Because Texas's position as a one-party Democratic state, the primaries were the only real election in the state. A series of Supreme Court decisions first upheld, but then struck down this provision, starting with Newberry v. United States in 1921, which upheld the white primaries having, in no real sense, part of the manner of holding the general election. This was a popular decision with southern states, but it was subsequently struck down in 1927, and then Nixon v. Condon in 1932 authorized by law state executive committees were to determine qualifications for voting in their primaries. The Supreme Court struck this down, holding that the state executive committees were acting as agents of the state and in violation of the 14th Amendment. Then, in Grovey v. Townsend in 1935, the court held that there was no violation of the 14th Amendment. The Democratic Party convention passed a resolution confining party membership to white citizens. The Supreme Court upheld this on the grounds that the Equal Protection Clause only covered state action. The court upheld the white primary until 1944. The Supreme Court ruled that the operation of primary elections involved state activity and that the white primary involved unconstitutional state action in the Smith v. Allwright case. At least one Texas county upheld unofficial primaries by a Democratic political organization that excluded African Americans called the Jaybird Party. Terry v. Adams in 1953 was a Supreme Court decision that struck down the use of the Jaybird Party, an offshoot Democratic Party which pre-selected candidates for the Democratic primary in some counties, prohibiting African Americans from participating. Although the poll tax was made illegal in federal elections in 1964 by the passage of the 24th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, it remained legal in state elections in Texas until 1966. Even after its elimination, Texas continued to require early registration for voting more than 9 months before the general election every year. Early registration, along with property requirements and residency requirements, affected traveling workers. Voters had to live in the state for at least 1 year and the county for at least 6 months prior to voting. All of these provisions were voided by the courts in the 1970s because they unduly restricted the franchise. Had Texas maintained a competitive two-party system during this time, it might have had a more difficult time imposing and maintaining restrictions on the franchise. In a competitive two-party system, to obtain and retain power, both parties have to search for ways to build and increase their base of support. In a one-party system, the party looks to restrict participation in the party in order to retain control over it. African Americans had essentially no influence in state politics even once they could vote in the general election, since the winner of the Democratic primary always won the general election. Since the 1940s, there has been a gradual expansion of the franchise in Texas, often brought on by litigation in federal courts by African American and Latino civil rights organizations, like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, aka the NAACP, and the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, or MALDEF. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed by Congress to ensure that African Americans would be guaranteed the right to vote. Lyndon B. Johnson signed the new law knowing it would hurt his political popularity in the South. It's been renewed several times since 1965 and prevents the dilution of minority voting strength. Federal examiners were sent to southern states to register voters because in many southern states, including Texas, African Americans were systemically denied the ability to register to vote, let alone actually attempt to vote. In Texas, just prior to the Voting Rights Act, approximately 35% of African Americans were registered to vote, but by 1971, the figure almost doubled to nearly 65%. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act involves a nationwide prohibition against the restriction of voting rights on the basis of race or ethnicity. Bilingual ballots are now required in areas where more than 5% of voters speak a language other than English. Partisan legislation passed in 2011 requires a photo ID in order to vote. Republicans claim it prevents voter fraud, while Democrats claim voter fraud is minimal and that the law disproportionately affects low-income individuals, students, and minorities, most of whom typically vote Democrat. In 2015, a federal appeals court ruled the law violated the Voting Rights Act because it had an impact on minority voters. Texas has appealed the ruling, arguing that Texas and other southern states should not be singled out for special scrutiny of their electoral practices and should be allowed to have a voter ID law without any approval process. In 2016, Texas agreed that more forms of voter ID than its law authorized would be accepted at the polls. A voter must be 18 years old, a U.S. citizen, and a resident of both Texas, and the only reasons why a citizen may not vote are if he or she is a felon who has not completed their full sentence or is judged by a court to be mentally incompetent. According to the Texas Secretary of State, 79.4% of the state's voting age population, which is roughly 15.8 million citizens, were registered to vote in 2018. The National Motor Voter Law, passed in 1993, requires states to allow people to register to vote when applying for a driver's license, helping to increase registration. Public schools distribute voter registration cards as students turn 18, and most colleges and universities sponsor drives to encourage their students to register. Efforts between the Secretary of State's office and corporations also increase the number of registered voters. Following the 2016 election, the Census Bureau's survey of Texans found that Latino-eligible voters registered at a 38.3% rate, well below that of African Americans at 70.2% and non-Hispanic whites at 71.6%. Early voting allows voters to cast ballots during a 2-week period before the regularly scheduled election date, instead of just the 12-hour period on election day. The legislature has allowed early voting in an effort to increase participation by accommodating those who have trouble getting to the polls between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. on election day. For most elections, early voting begins the 17th day before an election and ends 4 days before it. Voting early is basically the same as voting on election day. A voter appears at one of the designated early voting polling places, presents their ID, and receives and casts a ballot. Since it was introduced in Texas in the late 1980s, early voting has barely increased voting participation. Predictions that Democrats would benefit from it didn't come true, and in the elections of 2014, 2016, and 2018, early voting has not benefited either party significantly. Straight ticket voting is the practice of voters pressing one button in the voting booth to register their vote for all candidates in one political party. A new law signed by Governor Abbott eliminates straight ticket voting starting with the 2020 elections. This was mainly because Republican judges in some of the populous counties, such as Harris, were losing elections due to straight ticket Democratic voting. In 2016, nearly 64% of Texans in the state's 10 largest counties voted straight ticket. Every 10 years, the U.S. Census is charged with counting how many people live in the United States and reapportionment to determine how many congressional seats each state will receive, depending on how the population shifts. The state legislature must draw new congressional districts at least every 10 years to comply with the new overall number of seats allowed, as well as the principle of one person, one vote. Redistricting is the process of redrawing election districts and redistributing legislative representation in the Texas House, the Texas Senate, and the U.S. House. Redistricting is always an obvious political move in every state because the majority party uses it to retain power by creating as many friendly districts as it can. How districts are drawn can have an important effect on the political outcomes at the local level. The 67% growth in the population between 2000 and 2010 can be attributed in part to the growing Latino population, which poses a threat to the Republican Party and plays a major role in how the new district lines are drawn. Until the 2013 U.S. Supreme Court decision in Shelby County v. Holder, Texas had to comply with the Voting Rights Act, requiring that any changes to the election procedures, including the drawing of new district lines, must go through the process of pre-clearance by federal authorities. Because of the federal court's lengthy approval process for these districts, the March 2012 Texas primary had to be pushed back to May 29th. Critics argue for nonpartisan redistricting commissions, like other states have, to eliminate the partisan nature of redistricting. In 2015, in court case Evenwell v. Abbott, plaintiffs sued the state of Texas, argued that using the total number of residents in each district as the basis for creating state legislative districts violated the principle of one person, one vote and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Arguing that the state should use registered or eligible voters to draw district lines because voters living in districts with high numbers of undocumented immigrants, children, or prisoners had their votes unconstitutionally diluted compared to those voters in other districts. The Supreme Court ruled that states were justified in using total population in drawing legislative districts. Texas ranks last in the nation in voter participation despite efforts to increase voter registration and implementation of early voting. Several factors could contribute to the state's low participation rates, such as low levels of educational attainment, low per capita income, high rate of poverty, location in the South, young population, lack of party competition, lack of media attention to substantive political issues, and a large number of undocumented residents and felons. An individual's socioeconomic status is the most likely indicator of participation. In Texas, the lower the education or income level, the less likely it is for someone to vote. Like I've said before, Texas has a large Latino population, many of whom are not registered to vote or aren't citizens. Registration rates and voting rates among Latinos will likely increase in coming years, but for now they remain lower than any other demographic. There are several issues with voting in Texas today. There are so many elections and so many candidates for office that voters simply feel overwhelmed when it comes to voting. Some believe that if there were fewer elections, the ballot might be longer, but the voter turnout would likely be higher because more voters would be attracted to at least some of the races or issues on the ballot. Some also argue that holding elections for state offices in non-presidential election years decreases voter turnout because participation tends to be highest during the presidential election. Most elections in Texas involve very low visibility offices, and few voters know much about these positions or their candidates. Not knowing anything about the election or the candidates naturally discourages voting. Some even suggest that the voter identification law has reduced voter turnout even more. While non-Hispanic whites make up less than half the population of Texas, this does not mean that the majority of the state voters are minorities. In the November 2018 elections, Latinos composed only about 26% of the Texas electorate as a result of a variety of factors. Non-Hispanic whites have significantly more influence in the state electorate, and because most whites tend to vote for Republicans, the balance of power in most state elections tilts towards the Republicans. There are still barriers to voting, such as reducing the number of polling places in certain areas, giving misleading information to voters, and intimidating voters by threatening employment or other economic retaliation. While these actions are becoming less frequent, there are still reports of them in every contested election. With Republican dominance in Texas, the Republican primary determines the winner of statewide elections, despite low voter turnout in primary races. Only 10.16% of registered voters and only 7.79% of the voting age population in Texas voted in the Republican primary in 2018. And since the 1990s, the winner of the primary has gone on to win every statewide election. In the 2012 elections, a person could have won statewide office with the votes of less than 5.6% of the registered voters in Texas if the voters were to have cast their ballots in the Republican primary. Campaigns are designed for candidates to gain support to win primary and general elections. Some campaigns last a year or more, but the more accepted practice is to limit the campaign to a few months before the election. For high-profile races such as governor, candidates often announce they intend to run early in order to raise money. Candidates with more money are often taken more seriously by other campaign donors, as well as by the media, interest groups, and the national parties. Anyone can run for office in Texas, but political experience or incumbency are an advantage. Challengers to incumbents rarely win, and many wait until a retirement comes along to run for a seat. Career paths for Texan office holders usually begin with a run for a local office, such as school board or city council. Many then decide to run for state representative and then state senator. Candidates for the U.S. Congress usually have had prior political experience. Since there are no term limits in the Texas legislature, some members have served for many years. Running a campaign is expensive. Abbott spent $46 million in his campaign for governor in 2018. These costs include trying to reach voters through print and electronic media, the mail, door-to-door campaigning, speeches to large and small crowds, coffee hours, and telephone solicitation. Media ads are a majority of these expenses. Full-page ads in a metropolitan newspaper can cost as much as $40,000. Candidates are always trying to raise money throughout the campaign process, hosting events with donors, making calls to potential donors, and setting up websites that make it easy for people to contribute. Partisan affiliation matters a lot when it comes to raising money. The more money, the more likely the win. For all statewide offices, Republican campaign contributions have overwhelmed Democratic campaign contributions. According to the Texas Tribune, in 2018, 86% of the $57 million in contributions went to the Republican candidates for state offices. Candidates for federal offices are limited by strict federal campaign finance laws, while candidates for state office are subject to laws established in 1991 by the Texas Ethics Commission. The federal laws have been weakened by U.S. Supreme Court decisions that parts of these laws unconstitutionally restricted free speech. State candidates and lobbyists must file quarterly reports with the TEC detailing expenditures and contributions, but with the exception of judicial campaigns, there are no limits to campaign contributions for state races. The state imposes a temporary prohibition on contributions to state legislators prior to the beginning of the legislative session. Interest groups, which I've talked about in a different video, have become increasingly important in Texas elections. State legislators and other statewide officials are subject to limited campaign regulations, allowing interest groups to have huge influence in Texas politics. Candidates in Texas take the lead in planning, running, and funding their campaigns. The Democratic or Republican label is important, though, because many voters use the party label in casting their votes, especially for low visibility races. The party does provide some direct support for the candidate, most commonly through to get out the vote for their party's candidates. The party contains numerous activists that the candidate can use for campaign tasks like manning phone banks, preparing mailings, and posting campaign ads. Party leaders will try to recruit individuals to run for office sometimes, especially if no candidates volunteer to seek an office or if the announced candidate appear to be weak. Incumbents hold advantage in election campaigns. Office holders have several ways to achieve name visibility, like mailing out news releases, sending newsletters to their constituents, appearing on television and radio talk shows, and giving speeches to civic clubs. Newspaper coverage and local TV news coverage of the politician can also increase name recognition. Challengers have a more difficult time getting this crucial name visibility. As important as name recognition is, even more important is that a campaign be well designed and well executed. A hiccup in a well-funded campaign can generate controversy and potentially cost the candidate the vote. Political candidates in Texas campaigns hire pollsters to conduct surveys of their constituents in order to get a sense of what they think on important issues. Candidates want to make sure that they're voting in line with what their constituents want so that voters will choose to support them in future elections. Politicians target voters based on information such as where they live, their age, and other factors, and contact them with specific messages they think will inspire them to vote. In close elections, tailoring a message to a significant voter group like suburban women with children, college-educated men or senior citizens might make a difference. Public opinion on particular policy areas can vary widely according to race and ethnicity. For example, while most Latinos in Texas support the DREAM Act, most whites in Texas oppose it. Texas campaigns are usually covered by local and statewide media, like the Texas Tribune and other major city newspapers. Newspapers endorse candidates for primary and general elections and can be especially important in down-ballot races for local offices such as school board or city council. Television stations also host programs to inform the people about current races at the same time providing paid advertising time to candidates. Running a campaign can be expensive, and an opportunity for free airtime to increase name recognition can go a long way, especially in down-ballot races. Television and newspaper ads have historically been valuable to a campaign, but times have changed and many candidates are turning to social media to spread their messages. It can often reach a wider audience while costing little to no money. Texas candidates for all offices use Facebook and Twitter to push campaign messages, attack or defend themselves from opponents, and just to stay in touch with their supporters and donors. We can also see the big role that Twitter plays at a federal level, most notably with President Trump. We've also seen how this can positively or negatively impact a politician. In 2014, the candidates argued over education, equal pay for equal work, gun rights, and immigration. Candidates for lieutenant governor joined the immigration debate in 2014, while candidates for Texas comptroller argued over tax policy. O'Rourke rallied young voters across the state and stressed universal health care, justice for dreamers, and standing with those who kneeled during the national anthem at NFL games. Gun rights and immigration continue to be important issues. As of 2016, Texas allows permit holders open carry of personal firearms in most public places, although individual businesses can choose not to allow it. In 2018, much of the focus in the race for governor was on sanctuary cities, border security, education, and infrastructure improvements. Gun safety in schools has become an issue again within recent years, especially after the Santa Fe school shooting in May 2018. Republican candidates, all major elective offices, pledged to enact strict border security measures and spend state resources on keeping illegal immigrants out of the state. This is a big change from the 1990s when the then Governor George W. Bush appealed to the Latino vote in the state. Tax policy is important, especially the issue of property tax reform. Since Texas does not have a state income tax, property taxes are somewhat higher than in other states. The state relies on property taxes to fund public education and on sales taxes for other state spending. The sales tax in Texas averages 8.25% on most items, with the exception of medicine and groceries, and increasing them disproportionately affects Texans with lower income, since a higher percentage of their income is spent on purchasing goods and services. In statewide elections, there is a lack of attention to state issues. Republicans did not change the positions they held in the primary, continuing to stress issues such as immigration and support for Trump. Democratic candidates in Texas, to attract support from the Democratic base, ran hard against President Trump and his policies. Congressional Democratic candidates ran issue ads on health care, promising to protect people with pre-existing conditions and increase access to affordable health care. Democrats were encouraged by some of the narrowest margins in recent history. Most attribute this to Beto O'Rourke, who energized and mobilized millennials, and to voters in the major cities and suburbs. In recent races, many statewide candidates decided not to emphasize statewide issues, choosing to focus on discontent about candidates at the national level. Tea Party candidates have been challenging less conservative Republicans in the state legislature, and Texas has seen a deepening divide in voting patterns between urban and suburban areas. especially in Houston and Dallas, with the suburban areas slowly shifting to Democrats. After the 2018 election, Republicans kept control of both chambers of the state legislature, but Democrats picked up 12 seats in the state House and 2 seats in the state Senate. This was the largest shift in seats since 2010. These seats largely come from suburban areas in Dallas and Houston, which, like I said, have slowly become more Democratic. Many of the statewide races have become much closer in recent years, and we'll see if the Republican strength will return or if Democrats will maintain and expand in the future. In this chapter, we learn that although Republicans have been winning statewide elections in Texas in the recent years, the growing Latino population and increased diversification of the state may change this pattern. Campaigns are very expensive, especially in statewide elections where candidates are raising their own funds. Candidates are also often wealthy people that are willing to donate their own money to the campaign. Even though Texas used to restrict the right to vote with poll taxes and white primaries, the right to vote has been expanded through the motor voter law and early voting. Even with these changes, voter participation is the lowest in the nation. Contributions to the low turnout include the demographics of Texas voters and the state's political culture, scheduling of elections, large number of elections, and low visibility for many candidates. One of the largest factors that could affect future Texas elections is the state's changing demographics. The proportion of Latino voters in Texas is growing, and that of white voters is shrinking. Latinos in Texas are more likely to identify as Democrats than Republicans, and if more Latinos register to vote and participate in state elections, Texas may once again become a competitive two-party state. The chapter objectives included being able to describe the types of elections held in Texas and explain how they work, explain how the rules for voting affect turnout among different groups of Texans, and present the main features of election campaigns in Texas. Texas registered voters have the choice to vote in one party primary during an election cycle. If a candidate doesn't receive a majority vote in a primary, a runoff is held. The general election then decides who's elected to office. Participation in Texas elections vary. Turnout is the lowest in party primaries and then in elections when a presidential candidate is not on the ballot. Latinos and people of lower socioeconomic status are also less likely to vote in state elections. Statewide campaigns and mobilizing voters can be expensive because Texas is so big and there are several major media markets. This makes television advertising very expensive and means wealthy candidates are more often on the ballot. So that's it for today's video. Make sure you register to vote and use your vote to make a change. Please feel free to join me in the comments below. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you learned something new, and I hope you have a great day. And as always, please remember to like and subscribe. Thanks.